Thank you. Can you hear me? Let's try again. Can you hear me now? Okay. I should start by saying that I think it was in the Hollywood Reporter a few weeks ago that there was a report of your presentation at the Ghent Film Festival that apparently you spoke for 6 hours, and when the host got up and apologized that really they have to give you a little break, the audience booed the host. I don't want to be in that position. Let's get right into things. We heard all the things you've edited, The English Patient, The Godfather, The Apocalypse Now, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and so forth. What were you doing about a year ago?
Well, this, I think, falls under the category of old dogs and new tricks. This is because of the various things, the turbulence of the economy and the vicissitudes of the film industry. A number of jobs that I was supposed to do fell apart, and so I was twiddling my thumbs, and George Lucas, who I went to school with at USC in the 60s, said, "Why don't you direct an episode of Clone Wars," which is their animated series that shows up on the Cartoon Network on Friday nights. So I said, "Sure, let me find out what that's all about." And this is a 3D animation, not optically 3D, but the sense that it's the digital equivalent of marionettes, except that the strings are invisible lines of ones and zeros. But effectively, you have characters who have been designed, you have sets that have been designed, all digital, but you as the director are sitting there and positioning the characters through very complicated software, which I had to learn, and then you say, "Okay, go get them," and you cause the characters to do something, you look at it, you make modifications, and then there's a big explosion. You go on from there. So
why don't you show us some of the, this was just on TV the other day, right?
This episode that I did last year just ran on the Cartoon Network a week ago Friday. So, put your mind back to Saturday morning serials, cartoons, the sort of adventure. This is the Clone Army. I won't explain that, but those of you who know what that means. And they have been sent out on a kind of a suicide mission on an unfamiliar dark planet. And, well, no more needs to be said here. I think we need to lower the lights a bit, because it's a very dim, dark planet. So if there's anything we can do about the lights...
Can we turn down the lights? Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Long ago in a galaxy very, very dark.
Right. These are the two guys who've been sent behind front lines.
So, how do I start this thing? Well, how should I know? Start pushing buttons. Man, these things are ray shielded. think I can do this? Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's hope this trip was worth it. All right, let's go.
Now, my auteur theory of the Clone Wars is that is a very good representation of your own situation,
Yes.
trying to learn how to
Right,
command this thing.
These two guys who are foot soldiers have been asked to go and commandeer these airplanes, which they have no idea how to drive. And of course, the rest of the troop is somewhere else, and they're going to bring these planes that are enemy planes in and save the day. So this
was basically your situation.
Yes, exactly.
And when I went to see you, it really was your situation, because the thing you're working on are just knobs, basically, and you have to, and you're turning these knobs kind of like them. Trying to figure out what's good.
Again, if you have in your mind literal marionettes with strings, this is digital marionettes with knobs, and you position them. You position a character in one position, and then you go 10 seconds ahead and you do another position, and then the computer figures out how to get from position 1 to position 2. You look at that and you say, let me make this little modification in the middle. So you interpose a data point in there with a third position, and now you look at that, and it's just an endless series of these kind of things. It took me, I was working on this for 12 weeks, so it's a very rapid process.
Did you have these whoa moments?
Well, yeah, we record the dialogue. We record the dialogue just among ourselves, just scratch tracks to see what works. And then when it's close to being complete, then we bring in the actors. This is an ongoing series, and I should say that this was the second in a 4-part story arc, so that things have been established in the week before, and yesterday there was the 3rd episode, and next week everything comes to a dramatic conclusion. So
it gives me a chance to get into what I really want to get into with you, which is analog versus digital. I mean, it occurs to me that the first time you worked with THX 11 with Lucas was in college at USC, and it was THX 1138.
Yes, that was THX 1138 was a student film before it was a feature film, and it won all kinds of prizes. It was a script that Matthew Robbins and I wrote. We were intending to make it as a student project, and then we got fascinated by something else. And George Lucas, who was at school with us, as I said, he was looking for something to direct, and he said, "What are you going to do with that underground story that you wrote?" And we said, "Take it, make it." So he did, and he did a much more wonderful job of it than I'm sure we would have done. But a couple of years later, George had hooked up with Francis Coppola, and they had both convinced Warner Brothers that it would be a good idea to make a feature film out of this film. So then George asked me to collaborate with him on the screenplay, and I wound up also doing the sound on it.
And in terms of talking, this being analog, this is the old days. Can you describe? It occurs to me we can talk about the footsteps of the robots in terms of what it was like to do sound in those days.
Yeah, I mean, this was very low-budget filmmaking. We were shooting in San Francisco, which is where we had set up this American Zoetrope studio, which was an attempt to continue our happy-go-lucky student life, but hopefully to try to make commercial feature films. And so we didn't have enough money to do everything that we might have wanted to, and one of the elements in the story, as you know, George loves robots. They fill up. Here we are again with these guys, and these robots were supposedly 600-pound collections of metal. Really, there was just a human being in there, but to generate an effective sound for this, we had to re-record all of their footsteps, and I cooked up some crazy contraption that I put on my feet, and I stomped around the African Hall at the Museum of Natural History in San Francisco, getting these nice echoey sounds. Oh yes, okay, that's my last film,
okay,
or the latest film.
Okay, keep going.
Right, and anyway, the problem was I suddenly had to cut all of these sounds
so
in
I want
one
to
by
make
one.
people understand that you were recording with these heavy sounds in this very echo-like chamber, but you were recording on tape, right? Children, do you know what tape is?
Yeah.
Anybody here not know what tape is? But it was so you had strings of tape, basically, or what do you call it?
Yeah, no, this is all using technology that in its essence had not, this was in the late 60s, but it really had not changed much in 30 years, other than the arrival of magnetic tape. But
so each footstep was a
was a
piece of tape like that, about that long, or something?
Yeah, we transfer it to film, so I'm cutting sprocketed material. The problem was this was a tremendous amount of work because every footstep had to be cut in place. If we were doing this the official way of doing it, we would have been projecting the film and somebody would have been walking along with the robots at the same time. This is called Foley in Hollywood, but we couldn't afford that, so this was labor intensive. The thing that came to my rescue was the discovery of a principle, which we might talk about later on, that the human mind can focus on only so many things at one time. And if you have one robot and the robot is walking at you, you have to lay everything in sync, because if it's not, then the mind says something's wrong. If you have two robots, I discovered this also had to be in sync. So I had to do this work. But as soon as there were more than two robots, nothing had to be in sync anymore.
So if you just go...
Yeah, I'm exaggerating for the purposes of but the sync is a group of robots sound and a group of robots visual. As the mind is satisfied with this, it's not going to count every single footstep. And so that something mysterious happens between the numbers 2 and 3. And we can see this in other areas of life as well. From the religious to the musical, there is a kind of a break point somewhere around 2 or 3, which is the separation from where you're able to focus on trees and where you begin to see the large accumulation, the forest.
Is that in calligraphy, in Chinese calligraphy? Or?
Right. If in Chinese writing, if you want to draw the symbol for tree, it kind of looks like a tree. It's like a pine tree with its boughs down. If you want to draw the symbol for a forest, you draw 3 of those trees clumped together. And clearly this gets across the idea of many. Had it been otherwise, the Chinese might have had to draw 6 trees or 10 trees, but then that gets very dense and confusing, and you lose the idea of it. So as I've gone through, there are many times when I've been in a relatively desperate situation, and I've remembered 2.5.
Well, I was going to say, we can maybe go to this right now, because you were telling me the other day that the last film that was all analog, that you worked on, was that Julia?
The last film...
Where you were working without computers.
Yeah, well, the last film in which there was not even the whisper of a computer was 1976, 1977, the film Julia with Jane Fonda and Vanessa Redgrave, Jason Robards, which we shot in England, but that was strictly analog in every sense of the word. On Apocalypse Now, which was the film I did right after that, Francis had started using a word processing program to write the script, and we mixed the sound on a mixing board that had a computer attached to it, so that would remember all of the moves of the faders we did, and that was the first time that a computerized mixing board had been used on a film.
Were you still using tape?
We were
plus
still, everything else was analog. We were still, the digital future was probably 15 years ahead, a completely digital editing environment.
Okay, well, let's get to Apocalypse. Show us how that rule of 3 applied in Apocalypse Now.
Well, let me see if I can get here. This is me back in 1978, I think. And I'm surrounded by these tendrils of celluloid, which was Apocalypse Now at the time. I was looking for a trim here, and this is how you did it. It's something, these little fragments of film would sometimes fall to the bottom of the physical bin, and you'd have to, like bobbing for apples, you'd have to go and find it, and everything depended on finding this little fragment of film. Because if you couldn't find it, it became very time-consuming and expensive. One thing to keep in mind is that the physicality of film really does have a cost to it, and 35 millimeter sound and picture costs you £1 a minute. So a minute of 35 millimeter work print and sound is £1. And Apocalypse Now had 14,000 of those minutes, which meant that there was 7 tons of work print scattered all over the editing rooms
and
where
at any
we
given
were.
moment, you're trying to find one particular one.
Right, and you have to go in and find a single frame which weighs, I don't know, 5/1000th of an ounce. So there's a big disparity there between 7 tons, and we had, if you wanted to work in film, you had to have strong arms and backs to move that stuff around, but at the same time, it had to be very precise. And now that's gone, Technicolor is out of business, or out of the physical film business, and Kodak is flirting with bankruptcy, whether they are or not, we'll find out. Panavision and Ariflex, these camera companies, are no longer making film cameras, and here in Chicago, Lavezzi Precision, which was the last manufacturer of physical sprocket wheels, now no longer makes these things. So we've tumbled, it's been coming at us for a while, and now we're in it, and everything has turned into a stream of zeros and ones, and we just have to find our way through that particular jungle rather than the physical jungle.
It occurs to me, before we do the Apocalypse Now thing, you can tell about this, but you talk about...
This is the last film. I just finished this film about a month ago. Hemingway and Gellhorn, directed by Phil Kaufman with Nicole Kidman and Clive Owen. It's the story of the meeting and love affair and marriage and unmarriage of Ernest Hemingway and Martha Gellhorn. Martha was the preeminent war reporter covering wars from the Spanish Civil War all the way to Bosnia in the early 90s. So they had a very hot love affair, but lots of wonderful conflict, which makes it very dramatic. But this is a way of representing every frame of that film. It's
as opposed to 7 tons.
Yeah, so that's, in the old days, that would be many, many pounds of stuff, and now it's weightless.
We might go back to Apocalypse Now in a second, but first, you were going to talk about fungibility, which I think is interesting in this context.
Sure. This is, no, it's a wonderful sounding word, but it's been responsible for some of the biggest transformations in recent human history. Transformations to do with money and energy and information. And there was the discovery and implementation of what we now know as the banking system in 1500, where people discovered to transfer money, you didn't have to actually move the money itself. You could write a check or the equivalent of a check. And so this became weightless. And once it was weightless, we discovered that it's got a number attached to it, and if it has a number, then we can exchange anything for anything. A piece of land for a skill, or for some produce, or for metal, or for grain futures, or whatever. Everything now had a number, and once it had a number, there was this magical alchemy that really transformed. It was the birth of capitalism, and we're dealing with the after effects of that as we speak. And then this other transformation of energy, which really began to bite in 1900, the discovery of electromagnetism in the middle of the 19th century, the fact that you could take energy and turn it into a stream of electrons, and at the end of a wire, like a magic wand, what do you want to do with it? You can cook toast, you can heat your house, you can make a telephone call, you can kill people with it. It's pure energy in this fungible form. It's ready to do whatever you want it to do. And now we're in the middle of this information fungibility, where information now, in terms of visual pictures or sound or who knows what's coming next, is just a stream of digits. And once it's that, you can make it into anything you want. And the implications of this, because this has really begun to hit hard now, and you can look at a lot of what the world is going through right now as this huge ball of everything now, the information, energy, and money. What more of a trinity can you think of for transformational stuff? But we're right in the middle of it, and where that's going to come, we don't know.
Actually, before we go, I'm going to go take you somewhere where we didn't say we were going to go, but it was a conversation we were having in the car one day about bubbles in terms of finance. Maybe you could bring that out.
Sure. This was just, I was struck by this, the incongruity of the seriousness of our dilemma and the fact that we were in the middle of the collapse of the housing bubble, and we'd gone through the dot-com bubble. And the word bubble conjures up, birthday parties and soap bubbles and balloons, and really kind of innocent things that somehow grow and somehow pop. And are we going to hear this pop every so often and kind of wipe our eyes and get back on our feet and go ahead? Certainly that's much of what we are being counseled to do right now. But when you think of what an economic bubble really is for whatever reason, something like the South Sea bubble or the tulip bubble, people get into this mania of the thing itself, which seems to have its own laws and will take advantage of whatever in its environment to nourish itself at the risk of hurting the very organism of which it is a part. And in a sense, a much better word for that would be tumor, because that's exactly what a tumor is. It's a cell or a group of cells that for some reason has lost the idea that it's actually part of your own body. It thinks, I'm alone, and it thinks it's in a hostile environment and an environment that could be plundered, and so it reaches out and grabs whatever around it to feed itself, growing to, at great risk to the organism of which it's a part, and ultimately to itself. So if we called it the housing tumor, we would have a very different relationship to what was actually going on.
If you use that analogy, by the way, I love apoptosis. Can you talk about that for a second? That's
in our body, when everything's going right, cancer cells are forming all the time. There are whatever 100 trillion cells in our body. You know, that's easily things can go wrong, and the body has a defense against this, which is called the immune system. And when a cell goes rogue, there's a police force, so to speak, that taps it on the shoulder and says, and it realizes what's wrong, and it goes into something that has this lovely onomatopoeic pronunciation of apoptosis, which is self-destruction. Oh, I didn't realize. And it disappears, either by its own agency, and if it doesn't do that, then killer cells come and actually take care of it itself. So, you know, you can look at the dynamics between aggressive capitalism and regulation as what's going on inside the body as the dialogue between this random formation of aggressive cells and the immune system. And, you know, clearly in society right now, something is out of whack.
If you went to a doctor, or if you had a tumor, you wouldn't go to a laissez-faire doctor. But anyway, coming back to the edge, I wanted to return. We were talking about analog becoming digital, and right at the edge of that was Apocalypse Now, and we were also talking about the rule of 2.5. And so maybe you can take us through this.
Well, I mean, we're as I was saying, we're right in the middle of one of these fungibility, you know, simultaneously a crisis and an opportunity with an unknown outcome. But at the same time, there are principles that are eternal, let's say, no matter what form that you're working in. And the form of what we've been working in film has changed, but underneath that are things that are perhaps more permanent. If I jump back here for a second, there's a wonderful line from Victor Fleming, who definitely was living in the analog world, and somebody asked him something about editing. He directed Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz that came out in the same year, and he said, good editing makes the film look well directed. Great editing, whatever that is, makes the film look like it wasn't directed at all. So it's the borderline between I admire the events that are happening and I can appreciate how well crafted things are, but implicit in that observation is a distance, which is I am here and it is there and I admire this. And that's good. Great editing or film construction dissolves that difference, and the audience is simply in the moment. They're not aware that it is a construction. They are somehow, there's been this simultaneous leap inward and outward where, imaginatively speaking, the minds of the audience have gone through the looking glass into the world of the film, and they are the characters in a very dreamlike state. And by the same token, the film has somehow leapt into their heads, and it's running around inside their heads like a dream does. It
occurs to me, in a different context, you spoke about good acting and great acting having to do with blinks.
Well, yes. Blinking is one of those aspects that is not only part of each of us, but it's part of a largely pre-conscious level of how we relate to people. And I have this theory that blinking, the rate of blinking has much more to do with the pattern of internal thinking than it does with any physiological need to moisten the surface of the eye. Of course, that is what's happening, but there's a great degree of latitude in when people blink. If it was only physiological, then like a thermostat, the person would come into a room and something in our sensory system would say, oh, the temperature is 72 degrees and the humidity is 56, set the blinking rate at once every 12 seconds or whatever. But you know, if you start really concentrating on when people blink, you see that this is not the case at all, that people go
Which is something you do if you're editing a film. You're really watching people blinking.
Right, and that to put it in headline form, the cut is a blink. It's where the shot that's been running has come to the end of whatever it can deliver, and now we need to see something else. And there's a blink. And what I discovered early on in editing Gene Hackman in The Conversation was that there was somehow a mysterious alignment, or it seemed mysterious to me at the time, between where Gene Hackman blinked and where I said cut. Or you know, when I hit the button that said stop. And I thought, am I picking up his blinking subconsciously and somehow making it happen? But this didn't seem to happen to all actors that I was working with. It's just that I think Gene Hackman was deeply in the character, and he was thinking the thoughts that the character was supposed to be thinking, and I was picking up the rhythm of that situation, and there was this alignment happening. So I began to watch when people blinked, and you know, came up with an elaboration of this theory, which I continue to use today. The funny thing that I ran into with Hemingway and Gellhorn, Martha Gellhorn is played by Nicole Kidman, and she was very Hackmanian in her blinking. And over it'd go thunk, and so there was this relationship developing between me and Nicole Kidman's image on the screen.
I've had exactly that thing happen with me.
Right,
Go ahead, yes.
Right. On the other hand, Clive Owen clearly had been very impressed by something that Michael Caine observed, and Michael and Clive had acted together in Children of Men, that wonderful film made a number of years ago. Michael Caine's suggestion to all cinema actors was never blink, because that will command the screen if you don't blink. And so here we were, and I was editing Clive Owen, and he never blinked.
But meanwhile, a bad actor will be thinking, "Gee, I delivered that line fantastically well."
Right. I think
and not be thinking what the character is thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what do we mean by bad acting? It's just the alignment of that actor, that person, with that part at that time was not successful. So even good actors can be bad actors, and by the same token, bad actors in the right part can be good actors. But in the squishy middle of it all, you get an actor who is overly concerned about what the director thinks of him. So he's saying the lines, but kind of on autopilot, really thinking, I wonder what the director thinks of me. And so his blinking will reflect his internal thoughts, which are necessarily not aligned now with what the character would be saying. And as a result, you don't trust him as a conveyor of this personality. And I think even in daily life, if you meet somebody whose blinking is off, and what's communicated is this person isn't really engaging with me. They're talking to me, but they're not thinking about what I'm saying, and there's a arrhythmia. You know, presidential debates are full of this kind of stuff. So there's there's lots of studies being.
There's three things they're full of. It's never mind. But I'm going to now get you back to Apocalypse Now. This is how we do an interview. We get you all excited. You want to hear about Apocalypse Now, and I just keep on taking you away. But now I'm taking you there.
Okay.
Blink.
So what I just like to show you is a selection of from one scene in Apocalypse Now, repeated over and over, but looking at different slices of what's going on here. One way to think about the process is pretend that this diagram is looking down, a camera looking down on an orchestra stage, and that half circle is where we're going to put the people playing the instruments, and that the audience is listening to them. And so there would be, if this was an orchestra, there would be violins and woodwinds and double basses and timpani and all of that stuff. For film, we're dealing with the same thing, except that our instruments include music as a category, but dialogue and all kinds of different sound effects. And if you think this way, you can begin to organize how you arrange the work and how you do it. So in approaching a film, the first thing I would mix would be the dialogue, which is the spinal column of the film. Under all circumstances, you have to hear and understand the dialogue, even if the dialogue is unimportant. Because if you can't understand the unimportant dialogue, you won't know that it's unimportant. So it's like a golden rule. It must be clear. And you know, if I have any argument with some films, it's that they let go of that idea.
And the dialogue is basically the violins, in a sense.
Yeah, you can think of it as the main melodic line, let's say. So, you know, as the violins are to the left of the conductor, so the dialogue, in this sense, is the left. And then there's this other category of dialogue, which is we call ADR, automatic dialogue replacement. And it's dialogue that's added after the fact. There's a wonderful line, Jean Renoir, the French director, you know, one of the greatest directors in the history of cinema, was an enemy of anything like this. He demanded that any sound in the film be recorded at the time and nothing else should be added. And there's a quote from his autobiography where he says, dubbing, which is what this is, dubbing is an act of the devil because it preaches the duality of the soul. And if we were living in the 12th century, predictors, practitioners of the art of dubbing would be burned at the stake. So, you know, I am a great practitioner of dubbing, so I would have disappeared long ago if Jean Renoir ran things. And then there are these other sound effects, you know, big sound effects, swords. This is from a particular film, quadraphonic effects, carriages, and then a whole subcategory of horses, which is kind of timpani in a way.
And in Apocalypse Now, that'll be helicopters, basically?
And Apocalypse Now, that would have been the helicopters.
And keep in mind, the helicopters were the airborne cavalry, was what they were called, yeah.
Right. And then crowds, and then birds and air, various kinds of insects, that kind of stuff. And then music, which is obviously crucial, but it has to fit within the large orchestra. And once you've got some of these other things in place, then you can bring the music in and allow everything. And then there are sometimes incidental sounds that really are not crucial. They have to be there, but you kind of add them at the last minute and just scoot them in to the extent that you need to. So with this idea in mind and kind of thinking about Apocalypse Now, I'm going to show you these mixes.
By the way, you recorded a lot of these things separately, right? So you had,
yes.
I think you told me one time, 180 separate...
Right, well, sometimes over 200 tracks. As I said, this was the first film to be mixed with a computerized mixing board, so we took wild advantage of this and everything proliferated, but we also had to go with the 7 tons aspect of it, so there was a huge amount of just physical moving of things. So here's this one scene, and we're just listening only to the dialogue track. In fact, the only sync dialogue in this scene is Robert Duvall at the very end of the scene, and there's a soldier in the middle who says, "I'm not going, I'm not going." Everything else is either recorded wild, almost as a sound effect of people in the background, or it's ADR. It's actors looking at the screen, adding their own dialogue to it. So let's see here. Those are wild sounds.
Where's Dom? Get me up here! Come on, get firm! Where's
We just had secondaries down there in the plaza. Blue 3, Blue 4, hold out over position X-ray. Duke 6, we've got wounded down there. Come on, Bob. I didn't do nothing. You're going to be back on the States in the let's get a stitcher over here. All right. That's it. Squeeze it out. Okay, Nicole. Stick with it. Come on, you're going to be okay. Give him some morphine. 037742. Where's that duster? I want my wounded out of there in the hospital in 15 minutes. I want my men out.
Now, by the way, that would have been many different, of the 200 pieces, that would have been 10 or 15 of them, but all mixed
25,
together. 25 of them mixed into one version. Okay, now let's see.
I should say that we're looking at it in black and white. There's a lot to be said about this. This is, again, old technology. We couldn't afford to work in color when we were cutting sound or mixing, so we made black and white, cheap copies of the film. And so we were doing all this complicated stuff, but looking at it in black and white, which is what you're looking at it here. Also, this was all done in this 5.1 sound format that we were inventing for Apocalypse Now. It has since become the film standard, but Apocalypse was the first film to have this and really exploit this.
What's called
format.
Sensurround, basically? Is it Sensurround? Is that kind of?
Yeah, it's Sensurround and multi-round. You can fly helicopters, as we did, all the way around the theater. So it surrounds the audience in 360 degrees of sound, if that's what you want. And it goes into the infrasonic, down to sounds that you no longer hear with your ears, but you feel with your gut.
I know you were telling me once that Francis originally thought that he would just do it in one theater in Iowa or something.
Yes, there was this kind of Wagnerian Bayreuth dream that Francis had, that Apocalypse Now would only play in one theater in the geographic center of the United States, somewhere around Lawrence, Kansas. And people would go to that theater like going to Mount Rushmore, and it would be there forever. And it would be 5 hours long, and you would go and see the first 2.5 hours, and then you'd have dinner, and you'd talk about the film, and then you'd see the second half. And families would come from all over to see this. But to make it impressive, Francis said, I want to surround the audience with sound, like helicopters, you know, like it really was in Vietnam. And I want explosions to be so low in that they hit you in your gut like they really do. And so we designed a sound format to fit this imaginary Bayreuth, the American cinematic Bayreuth equivalent, which never happened, obviously, although IMAX theaters are now kind of the equivalent.
But so you had the effect of turning every theater in the country into that theater.
Right, and that's effectively what has happened now. Every theater in the United States has a 5.1 sound system, but it all came out of this really kind of mad idea, as frequently happens.
Let's continue, maybe show a little bit shorter sections, but just to give you a sense of how you mix it. So the second part was a helicopter track.
Yeah. So this would be, let's say, the
double basses.
The double basses and the second violins. Right? would go on, and well, we should play the music, just play the music. There's a wonderful subset with the Valkyries music, in that this was in the John Milius screenplay to put the Valkyries in, and Wren has a lovely essay in his new book, Uncanny Valley, talking about the history of the use of this music in film, from Birth of a Nation
to Nazi Luftwaffe footage, and directly from that to John Milius.
So we were using the Schulte Vienna Philharmonic recording of the Valkyries, and then too close to the release of the film, somebody somewhere said, "Do we have the rights to use this movie?" And so Francis wrote to Decca, who were the company, and they immediately wrote back, "No, under no circumstances can you use this film." I should say that this Apocalypse Now was made despite the opposition of the U.S. military. They never cooperated with the making of the film. So there was kind of a cloud over the film, which hadn't come out yet. Nobody knew, but they said no. And so panic set in. What are we going to do? And whenever there's a desperate situation, you triage. There's that 3 again. You break things down into 3 forms. Keep battling with Decca. Arrange to have it re-recorded using the same metrics with the San Francisco Symphony, and try to find another recording that we can get that hopefully approaches this. So I was responsible for the 3rd of those branches, and I went to Tower Records, rest in peace, and got all 17 recordings of the Valkyries that then existed, and broke down Schulte's metrics in 10-second chunks. As you all know, when music sounds regular, it is not regular, that the beat is always fluctuating, which gives it the sense of being a living thing. As soon as the beat becomes predictable, then something essential goes out of the music. So Schulte was doing this manipulation of the beat, and I had to track that and then find something else that did the same thing or close to it. And record after record rejected, no, until finally, I think it was Eric Leinsdorf and the LA Philharmonic came pretty close. And so I transferred that to 35 millimeter film. I lined it up to the same entrance point as the Schulte, pushed the go button, and everything seemed fine for about 15 seconds until suddenly I realized this kind of sinking feeling that this wasn't going to work, not because of the metrics, but because in Schulte's recording, at that moment, he had emphasized the brass. And so there was a metallic edge to something, and at that moment, we were looking down at the ocean past a rocket on the helicopter, and there was there was interactive stuff going on between the water and the brassy sound, and they emphasized each other in a sort of multi-sensory way. And Leinsdorf had emphasized the strings, and as a result, both the strings and the color of the water seemed to be dead. And so I phoned up Francis and said, "It's not going to work." And Francis said, "Well, I'll try one last thing." And he finally got hold of Schulte himself, and Schulte said, "Of course, dear boy. Why didn't you ask me in the first place?" So that's what's in the film. We never were able to get access to the master tapes, so what's in the film is simply the lift off of the LP. But that's what Kilgore would have done in the first place. So it's not.
So give us a little bit of this.
We just have a little flavor of this. So there were 6 of these layers, and the trick was how to make them all live happily together.
You told me that you were, after having gotten these 200 things down to 6 layers,
Right.
you just went into the theater, you put them all on, you were expecting it to be fantastic.
Right. They had all been mixed relative to each other, but what I expected to happen was simply to line everything up at unity and let it go, and it should have mixed itself. Instead, it collapsed into a kind of a meaningless racket. And I thought, what's happening? And then I realized, as I said earlier, oh yeah, 2.5. And so I remixed it, doing this complicated sort of shell game where the ball is always moving and the shells are always moving. And in fact, when you watch the final version of this, which...
Do you have it, the final version?
I don't have it with me, but you can... wish I did. You can see that there are never more than 2.5 of those layers going at any one time.
So for example, at certain points you hear the music. For example, when you're in Kilgore's,
right.
You hear the music, but you don't hear the people talking.
For instance, when that kid says, I'm not going, you can't hear the music. Even though, realistically, you're in the helicopter, which is broadcasting the music, so you should hear it louder than anything else. But I want to hear that guy's dialogue, and I want to hear the sound of the helicopter, and maybe a little of the small arms fire, but everything else is not there. And so this is happening at sort of 4-second, 5-second increments. Your impression when the scene is over that you've heard everything all the time, but that's what's happening in your head rather than what's happening objectively on the screen.
So in fact, one thing to say about what you do is you are scoring people's heads, not scoring the film in some sense.
Well, I think that's the big truth of all this, is that whatever we show on the screen really is just a trigger that causes cataclysmic effects to happen in the brain of the audience. We are just suggesting things. John Huston had a lovely line about this where he said the real projectors are the eyes and ears of the audience, that in a mental sense that's what's happening, and this is really just a control track. This is just like a little beam of electrons that says, think about this. What does this make you think of? And so what we try to do as much as possible is to suggest things rather than to completely present them. Of course, there are times when we do present, but our default position is suggest rather than show. And because this causes a kind of a conflict in the minds of the audience. What does that mean? I mean, they're not necessarily realizing this consciously, but their mind will leap into action and create a dimensionality that is really in their head rather than something that's objectively on screen.
We have about 5 more minutes. Can you talk about what it's like to do things all digitally now compared to what it was like to do it analog before, and what you've gained and what you've lost?
I think as I said, it's a moving target right now, so we'll find out. But my general feeling is that there has been a big gain because of this fungibility. I can transmute things, and I have access to much more. In the old days, the maximum number of soundtracks, when I'm editing, was 2, maybe 3. Now I can have 99. So it increases the kind of the hormonal level of the film tremendously, even during the editing process, and then of course it gets more so later on. The losses are, if you're making a piece of sculpture and you've paid $10,000 for this block of marble and you've got the chisel, you think about what you're doing. And that process of thinking before you strike the hammer is a healthy thing to do. And I've tried to maintain that. My old habits of thinking before hitting, I have maintained, even though the sort of siren song of digital stuff is just, don't bother with that, just dive in and we'll do something wonderful together. but I'm a little suspicious of that. So I do a lot of preparation, a lot of thinking ahead of time, which is sort of a reflex action, not only because that's the way I'm constituted, but because of my memory of coping with 7 tons of stuff.
You told me once, though, that if you're looking for a particular frame, in the old days, you would spin it.
Yes, this is sort of the mid-old days. On working on Apocalypse Now, I was using a chem editing machine. This was one of several European editing machines. The Steenbeck was another, and France had the Moritone. Italy had the Prevost. Every country had its own system. The German system was the one that came into the United States and conquered the moviola, which was the old way of doing it. And it meant that film was stored in 10-minute rolls because that was the efficient way to work with this machine. What would happen is
the 10-minute rolls are horizontally flat on a flat bed.
Right. The film is horizontal in rolls, and it spins through a prism, which is silent and doesn't damage the film and means you can move the film very fast. But you have this 10-minute thing to deal with. And so I might think, I think I need that close-up where she says fungible. And,
there have been 10 takes of that.
Right. So I'd look in my database, oh, that's roll 150. I'd get roll 150, put it on the machine, thread it through the prism, hit fast, and it would zip through. And I'm looking at the film because I'm waiting for where is that place where she says fungible. And as I'm doing that, of course, I'm looking at everything else on the way. And as likely as not, what would happen is that I would see something that was actually much better than what I was consciously looking for. So I got what I needed rather than what I wanted as the result of this inefficiency of that old system. And that is a loss.
Why is that?
Well, you with digital systems like Avid or Final Cut or Premiere or any of these systems, you can make the stuff go fast, but digital systems, the way they go fast is that they will show you one frame. If you want to go 10 times speed, it will say, yes, master, and it will show you one frame out of every 10, which means that you're not seeing 90% of what's there. Whereas the physical system made the prism spin faster, and so every frame was shown to you, but for 1/10 the amount of time that it used to, but you could still see things.
And your brain is an analog thing and not a digital thing.
Yes.
And you're linking an analog to an analog in those days.
Right. So I know I've tried. There are so many positive things about the way it's gone, and I've tried to create analogous situations and workflows that compensate for this. Let's call it a limitation of the digital systems, which otherwise don't seem limited at all. Shall we do questions?
Well, do we have? We're getting no. He's saying no. So now watch this. This is okay. We get to be Ghent right now, and I get to say, well, you know, we really have to give him time off now. So let's let him go, and you get to boo me for stopping him. But do you want to? Maybe we'll be up there for a few minutes up there by the tables, and if people want to come and talk to you about particular things, we can do that. But we're apparently supposed to clean out the hall. But thank you so much, Walter.
Thank you.